Victor Gideon is the villain of Resident Evil 9, but he doesn't see himself that way. He sees himself as the only person left who understands what Oswald Spencer was really trying to accomplish. While the world celebrated Umbrella's collapse and Spencer's death, Gideon quietly mourned the loss of a visionary. And in the years that followed, he dedicated his life to finishing what he believed Spencer started, even though he completely misunderstood what Spencer wanted in the end. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the sad story of Victor Gideon, his time working on the Tyrant Project at Umbrella, his belief in Spencer's vision of human evolution, his acquisition of Roadsill Chronic Care Center, where he continued forbidden experiments under the cover of a legitimate medical facility, and the moment he realized, too late, that Spencer had abandoned the ideology Gideon spent his entire life defending. This is the sad story of a true believer who outlived his God and couldn't accept that the God had changed his mind. Victor Gideon was born in 1972, entering the world as a man who would eventually be defined by his total absence from the historical record. Unlike the flamboyant Albert Wesker or the aristocratic Ashford lineage, Gideon existed as a professional ghost within the academic and corporate landscapes. He was a brilliant but socially isolated figure, a man whose early papers on cellular recursion suggested a mind capable of seeing the human body as a series of interlocking, programmable equations. This intellectual coldness is what first caught the eye of Umbrella talent scouts, who recognized in him a researcher who didn't care for the trappings of power, but for the purity of the ideology. The confirmed law offers almost nothing about his childhood or personal life, because, for Victor Gideon, life did not truly begin until he found the Umbrella Corporation. He was a man whose biography was a blank slate, waiting to be overwritten by the doctrine of forced evolution. While other scientists sought to move up the corporate ladder for financial gain, Gideon viewed his recruitment as a religious calling. He didn't see Oswald E. Spencer as a chief executive officer. He viewed him as a secular god, the singular architect of a future where humanity could finally be refined into something permanent. This relationship between the master and the student was one of absolute, one-sided devotion. Gideon worshipped Spencer from the margins, content to be one of the silent laborers who built the foundation of the pharmaceutical myth. He was not one of the individuals Spencer elevated publicly, but rather the kind of researcher who operated in the deep shadows of the classified sub-levels. This absence of a personal history is the most telling detail about the man he became. He hollowed himself out so that there would be more room for Umbrella's vision. Evidence suggests that Gideon's social isolation was a choice, a way to ensure that his clinical focus remained undisturbed by human empathy. He saw the world as a messy, geoentropic place that required the firm hand of a creator to organize. By the time he was officially brought into the fold, his identity had been completely replaced by the corporate mandates of the Spencer era. He was a man who had already sacrificed his soul to the science before he ever picked up a pipette, a student who was ready to be consumed by the Church of the Virus. It is theorized that Spencer recognized this specific brand of radicalization and exploited it to ensure the security of his most personal projects. Gideon was the perfect tool, a man with no family to ask questions and no ambitions beyond the fulfillment of his master's will. He was the student nobody remembers because he wanted it that way, preferring to be a ghost in the system than a name in the headlines. His early years were a preparation for a life of service to a god who would eventually leave him behind in the ruins of Raccoon City. The tragedy of Victor Gideon begins with this total surrender of the self. He was a man who believed that by serving Spencer, he was participating in the most important work in human history. He didn't realize that to the founder of Umbrella, he was just another disposable reagent in a global experiment. This foundational misunderstanding would dictate the next 30 years of his life, leading him into a dark hotel hallway and eventually into the heart of the Ark. He was the true believer who mistook a corporation for a church and a monster for a savior. By 1998, Victor Gideon had successfully integrated himself into the core of the corporation's research apparatus and working as a researcher on the Tyrant Project. This was the era when Umbrella was at the height of its global power and clinical secrecy. And for a man of Gideon's psychology, being inside those labs felt like standing at the center of the universe. He was tasked with the refinement of the Tyrant 103 program that would eventually produce the most iconic and terrifying monsters in the history of the franchise. To Gideon, these were not weapons of war. They were the prototypes for the new man. He was known among his colleagues for a level of dedication that bordered on the fanatical, often staying in the laboratories for days at a time to monitor the growth vats. There are anecdotal reports in the files suggesting he would talk to the incubating tyrants as if they were holy relics, seeing in their mutated forms the beauty of a superior biology. While other researchers were concerned with the marketability of the BOWs, Gideon was concerned with the purity of the evolution. He viewed the agonizing nature of the experiments as the necessary friction required to smooth the path toward human transcendence. Gideon's reverence for Spencer grew into a total ideological obsession during this period. He didn't just follow orders, he studied Spencer's philosophical writings with the intensity of a theologian. He believed that the Umbrella Corporation was the only institution on Earth with the courage to do what was necessary for the survival of the species. This radicalization allowed him to justify any atrocity, viewing the human subjects of the Tyrant Project as mere materials to be used in the service of a higher purpose. He had successfully removed himself from the human moral framework to inhabit the clinical coldness of the Master's vision. The Tyrant Project was, for Gideon, the physical manifestation of the Church's power. Each success was a confirmation of his faith, and each failure was a reason to push the science further. He saw the potential for a world where the frailties of the human condition, disease, aging, and weakness, could be purged through the viral forge. He was a scientist who had found his purpose in the creation of monsters, unaware that the monsters were a reflection of the man he was becoming. And he was the true believer who found his church in a stainless steel abattoir. It is widely suggested that Gideon's fanatical loyalty is what kept him safe from the internal purges that defined the later years of the company. Spencer knew that Gideon would never betray the vision because the vision was the only thing the man had left. This proximity to the greatest biological research in human history gave Gideon a sense of importance that he had never found in his previous academic life. He was no longer a ghost. He was a priest of the new flesh, serving a god who was preparing to burn the world to see what would survive the fire. The tragedy of this period is that Gideon was so blinded by his faith that he couldn't see the inherent instability of the T-virus. He saw perfection where there was only rot, and evolution where there was only mutation. He was a radicalized scientist who believed that the end justified the means, no matter how many bodies were piled in the incinerators. Joining Umbrella was the moment his path was set toward the crisis, a journey that began with the worship of a tyrant in a vat and would end with a parasite in his own spine. Because of his unquestioning loyalty, Oswell A. Spencer handpicked Dr. Victor Gideon to oversee the Advanced Research Knot facility, known internally as the ARK, as this was Spencer's most secret and significant undertaking, a project that was intended to be the final word in his biological legacy. Spencer told Gideon that Project Elpis was the key to the future, a mandate that the researcher accepted with a sense of religious awe. Being chosen as the keeper of the Master's greatest work was the pinnacle of Gideon's career, the moment he felt he had finally earned his place in the Founder's inner circle. However, Spencer, ever the clinical manipulator, deliberately misled his most devoted researcher about the true nature of Elpis. Gideon was led to believe that the project was a mechanism for consciousness transfer via the T-virus, a way for the elite of the world to survive the death of their physical bodies. In reality, Spencer was already pivoting toward a cure, an act of atonement that he kept hidden even from Gideon. This meant that Gideon spent decades building a temple to a weapon and a transcendence mechanism that didn't actually exist. The man trusted most with the project was the one who understood it the least. Gideon's work at the ARK was defined by this fundamental misreading of the data. He viewed the universal antiviral research as a component of the transfer process, assuming that the hope Spencer spoke of was the hope of eternal life for the few. He meticulously organized the sub-levels of the orphanage to process the genomic data of the foundlings, searching for the biological hard drive that would allow a human mind to be encoded into the marrow. He was a scientist working in the dark, his every effort directed toward a goal that his master had already abandoned in favor of a reset. The assignment at the Arco solidified Gideon's isolation from the rest of the world. He was the sentinel of a secret that he didn't fully grasp, a man whose entire life was now tethered to a buried laboratory beneath a nursery. He viewed the children above as reagents and the files below as scripture, dedicating every waking hour to the fulfillment of a mission that was based on a lie. This tragic irony is the core of Gideon's character. He was the most faithful servant of a god who had already changed his mind without telling his disciple. It is theorized that Spencer kept Gideon in the dark specifically to ensure that the project remained functional. If Gideon had known that Elpis was a cure intended to neutralize Umbrella's legacy, his fanatical devotion might have turned into a violent rejection. By letting Gideon believe the project was a weapon, Spencer ensured that his most capable researcher would continue to refine the antigen with the intensity of a man building a bomb. In Gideon was the engine of a salvation he would have hated if he had understood it. A scientist who was being used by his god one last time. The Elpis Project became the singular obsession that defined the rest of Gideon's life. It was the lens through which he viewed every subsequent event, from the fall of Raccoon City to the murder of Alyssa Ashcroft. He saw himself as the only one who could complete the work, the only one who truly understood the Master's key to the future. He was building a throne for a god who was already preparing his own requiem, a true believer who was destined to find that the room he spent 30 years trying to open contained only the undoing of everything he worshipped. The night of the Raccoon City outbreak and the subsequent destruction of the city was the moment Victor Gideon's world was incinerated. While the surface of the city was being transformed into a biological abattoir, Gideon was deep within the Ark sublevels, shielded from the immediate chaos by layers of reinforced concrete. He watched the monitors as his church was consumed by the very pathogens he had helped create, seeing the collapse of the institution that had given his life meaning. When the thermobaric missile finally sterilized the city, Gideon felt the shockwave of a world that had decided his god was a monster. The confirmed detail that the Elpis Project was officially shut down following the destruction of the city was a psychological blow from which Gideon never recovered. As the surface world turned into a radioactive crater, the order came from the remnants of the board of directors to abandon the Ark and destroy the data. Much to Gideon's dismay, the institution he worshipped had decided to cut its losses and run. He felt a profound sense of abandonment as Spencer disappeared into hiding, leaving the researcher who had dedicated his career to the founder's vision alone in a laboratory that was now a grave. What it means to a true believer when the church burns is a total psychological collapse. Gideon refused to accept that the era of Umbrella was over, choosing instead to stay underground in the RK for months after the strike. He survived on emergency rations and the belief that Spencer was still out there, watching and waiting for his most faithful servant to finish the work. He became the keeper of the grave, a phantom moving through the dark hallways of the sublevels, obsessed with the idea that the missile strike was just another test of his devotion. During this period of isolation, Gideon's radicalization moved from the corporate to the personal. He was no longer an umbrella scientist. He was a man with nothing left but the research and a deepening resentment for a world that had rejected the evolution. He saw the radioactive ash above as the price of humanity's ignorance, and the project below as the only way to exact revenge. The trauma of the 98 incident broke his remaining ties to reality, anchoring his mind to the Ark and the incomplete notes of a dead man. Evidence suggests that it was during these months in the dark that Gideon first began to formulate his own distorted interpretation of Project Elpis. Without the guidance of the board or the founder, he began to project his own desires for power and transcendence onto the antiviral data. He convinced himself that Spencer had left him a secret weapon, hidden behind the biological hard drive of the foundlings. He was a scientist who had turned his trauma into a new, even more dangerous faith. A man who would eventually emerge from the crater to hunt the hope of the future. The moment everything was taken from him was the moment he became truly dangerous. He had lost his church, his God, and his identity, leaving behind a hollowed-out vessel of scientific obsession. He emerged from the ruins of Raccoon City not as a survivor, but as a relic of a dead corporation determined to rebuild the temple from the ash. He was the ghost of the orphanage, a man who would spend the next 3 decades trying to reclaim a world that had been vaporized on a September night in 1998. Following the 1998 incident and the subsequent 2003 Raccoon trials, Victor Gideon entered a period of his life that can only be described as the wilderness years. While the international community hunted for the umbrella remnants and the legal system dismantled the pharmaceutical empire, Gideon existed as a phantom moving across the global black market. He traveled through Eastern Europe and the United States, using a network of dormant shell companies that Spencer had originally established for deep cover operations. He was a man who knew where to hide, because he knew exactly where the corporation had buried its institutional ghosts. During these years of social and professional exile, Gideon spent his time obsessively decoding the encrypted journals Spencer had left behind. He treated these documents as sacred texts, searching for the hidden meanings within the founder's increasingly poetic and paranoid language. Many believe this points toward a total break from traditional scientific methodology, as Gideon began to interpret clinical terms as religious metaphors. He saw Spencer's references to hope, Elpis, as a coded instruction for a biological reset switch. that would allow a human mind to survive the death of the body, a complete misreading of the universal antiviral's intent. The psychology of the true believer without a temple is one of absolute, unyielding focus. Gideon didn't just survive, he continued his research in secret, utilizing portable labs and the blood of those he could procure from the margins of society. He viewed the world as a temporary illusion that would eventually be cleared away by the science he was refining. He was a man whose faith did not collapse with the institution, but instead hardened into a singular obsession with reclaiming the Ark and the Elpis Project. He was the disciple who was determined to be more loyal than the master. Gideon's wilderness years were also a period of tactical preparation. He realized that to finish the work, he would eventually need the resources of a new institution, leading him to begin the slow process of infiltrating the shadow syndicates that were rising to replace Umbrella. He offered his scientific genius as a commodity, while secretly keeping the core of the Elpis data for himself. He was a man who was willing to work for anyone, as long as it provided the funding needed to return to Raccoon City. He was the Phantom Researcher, a name that appeared on the edges of every major biological incident for 20 years. Evidence suggests that his misinterpretation of Spencer's journals was fueled by a desperate need for the work to matter. If Elpis was just a cure, then Gideon's entire life had been a mistake. But if Elpis was a weapon of transcendence, then he was the savior of the Master's legacy. He chose the latter, building a complex psychological architecture to justify his continued atrocities. He spent his years combing through fragments of notes, trying to finish a project that the founder had deliberately kept incomplete to ensure it would never be weaponized. He was a man trying to finish a puzzle that was missing the most important piece. Ultimately, the wilderness years turned Victor Gideon into the definitive antagonist of the 998 legacy. He was the survivor who refused to move on, the scientist who refused to accept the death of his god. He was a relic of a dead church, moving through a world that had moved on to the mold and the C virus, while his mind remained locked in a laboratory beneath a city that no longer existed. He was waiting for the moment when the biological debt of the survivors would finally ripen, allowing him to return to the ruins and claim the hope he fundamentally misunderstood. In late 2003, following the final legal dissolution of Umbrella, Victor Gideon utilized the remnants of the Spencer Foundation to acquire the Roadsill Chronic Care Center. To the outside world, this was an act of humanitarian continuity, a way to provide palliative care for the dying in a quiet, institutional setting. In reality, it was the perfect front for Gideon's continued research, a site where he could conduct the harvest of human biological data without attracting the attention of the biodefense authorities. It was the birth of his new temple, built from the ruins of his master's public philanthropy. Rhodes Hill served as a biological collection point for those suffering from the long-term effects of viral exposure. Gideon began the systematic injection of refined viral strains into patients who came for end-of-life care, turning their terminal illness into a clinical study. He was looking for a specific genetic anchor that could hold the Elpis password, a human vessel capable of maintaining the stability he saw in the original foundling. The facility's basement was converted into a high-tech butcher shop, where the human host was treated as a disposable reagent, a process that Gideon viewed as a necessary refinement of the science. The confirmed function of Rhodes Hill as a blood farm highlights the total erosion of Gideon's ethics in the years following the 98 strike. He was no longer just a scientist. He was the manager of a slaughterhouse that operated behind a mask of medical care. He viewed the patients as useful stock, their suffering a data point in his pursuit of the transcendence he believed Spencer had promised. Many in the community interpret this as the ultimate victory of Umbrella's administrative evil, where the institution meant to provide comfort was repurposed for the manufacture of monsters. Gideon's choice of Rhodes Hill was a deliberate act of loyalty to Spencer's legacy. By buying the property of the founder's original foundation, he felt he was reclaiming the sacred ground of the church. He decorated the private offices with the Victorian furniture of the Spencer era, creating a psychological anchor to the 19th century eugenics that birthed the corporation. He was a man trying to reconstruct a master's vision from fragments and shell companies, believing that by surrounding himself with the trappings of the past, he could force the future to arrive. The facility became the site of the first subject numbering, a system that Gideon inherited from the Ark sublevels. Here, he began the clinical cataloguing of the failures, the patients whose genetic anchors were too weak to sustain the viral load. This bureaucratic precision provided Gideon with a sense of order in a world he still viewed as chaotic and entropic. He was a man who found comfort in the spreadsheet of the dying, a true believer who was willing to turn a hospital into a tomb to fund his holy mission. Rhodes Hill was the bridge between the hidden research of the Arche and the commercial interests of the syndicates. It was here that Gideon refined the data that he would eventually trade to the connections for their protection. He was a scientist who had successfully automated the atrocity, creating a self-sustaining cycle of procurement and harvest that would eventually produce Subject 171. He was the master of the ruins, a man who had built a new sanctuary for the darkness, ensuring that the legacy of Oswell E. Spencer would have a place to ripen until the time was right. As the years in the wilderness and at Rhodes Hill began to take their toll, Victor Gideon realized that his own human frailty was a ticking clock that could prevent him from seeing the completion of Project Elpis. In a final and agonizing act of devotion, he performed what he called a sacred integration upon his own body. He infected his spinal column with a modified Ne gamma parasite, a derivative of the Nemesis alpha parasite originally developed in the 1980s. This was not a choice made for survival, but for the gain of the strength and durability required to reclaim the Ark ruins. The integration of the parasite was a process of total biological surrender. The Ne gamma strain was designed to take control of the host's neural pathways, granting the stature and resilience of a Nemesis-class creature, while allowing the host to retain their human intelligence. This was the moment Gideon ceased being a scientist in a lab coat and became a BOW of his own making. He was no longer just researching the evolution. He was living it, his body a battlefield for the parasitic surges that threatened to overwhelm his remaining humanity. Evidence of this transformation was visible in the long, surgical stitching across Gideon's neck, a confirmed detail that served as the physical anchor for the parasite. These stitches were necessary to prevent the parasite from detaching his head during surges of cellular growth, a visceral testament to the instability of the science. Many believe this points toward a profound level of self-hatred, where Gideon viewed his own human form as an obstacle to be overcome. He was a man who worshipped the vision of a superior humanity so much that he was willing to be sewn into a monster to achieve it. The slow transformation that began with the parasite infection fundamentally altered Gideon's relationship with the world. He moved with a heavy, unnatural gait, his presence accompanied by the sound of the parasite's internal hum. He began to view the baseline humans around him as fragile and obsolete, from their lives insignificant compared to the biological power he now carried in his spine. This was the birth of the monster who would eventually hunt Grace Ashcroft, a man who had successfully turned his own biology into a tactical asset for a dead god. His assimilation with the Ne-gamma parasite granted him a persistent regeneration that allowed him to survive punishment that would kill any normal person, such as this was the physical manifestation of his faith, a biological refusal to die until the work was finished. However, the parasite also began to rot his mind, its influence bleeding into his thoughts and heightening his nihilism. He was a man who was literally losing himself to the science he worshipped, becoming a hollowed-out vessel for the very darkness he had spent his life refining. The day he became the monster was the day he finally proved his total loyalty to Spencer's vision. He had sacrificed his ethics at the Ark, his reputation at the trials, and now his body at Rhodes Hill. He was the most honest expression of what Umbrella always produced, a creature of absolute efficiency and zero empathy. He was the BOW who could still speak the Master's name, a true believer who had sewed himself into a nightmare to ensure that the new man would finally have a creator to worship. Dr. Victor Gideon's central obsession during the wilderness years was the theory of genetic epigenetic encoding, a concept he believed was the true purpose of Project Elpis. He became convinced that if a subject was exposed to a specific viral frequency at birth, their DNA would record a password or an ideology, effectively creating a biological hard drive that could be accessed decades later. He based this on Spencer's confirmed belief, documented in the Ark sub-level records, that the vision of great leaders was often lost when they died. Gideon theorized that Spencer had solved this problem by writing the future of humanity into the marrow of a foundling. This theory was the lens through which he viewed Grace Ashcroft, reducing her entire human existence to a piece of proprietary hardware. He believed that Spencer had literally written the password for the universal antigen into Grace's genomic structure, making her the essential component for the Ark's activation. This fundamental misunderstanding of the project, which was actually a simple, emotional synthesis of a human word, is what drove the clinical horror of the next 2 decades. Gideon was a man who was looking for a technical solution in a project that was designed as a human atonement. The tragedy of the memory transfer theory is that it was built on the incomplete notes of a master who had deliberately kept his disciple in the dark. Spencer had hidden the true nature of Elpis, even from Gideon, leaving his most devoted researcher to fill the gaps with his own assumptions and biases. Because Gideon worshipped the science of control and evolution, he could only see the project as a mechanism of control. He could not conceive of a Spencer who would choose a cure over a weapon, or a person over a prototype. He was a man who had successfully archived his master's hubris, but none of his master's regret. Many in the community interpret this misreading as the ultimate failure of the Umbrella scientific method. Gideon spent 30 years performing blood draws and genetic scans, searching for a blood memory that didn't exist, while the answer was waiting in a simple interview recording. He was a scientist who had lost the ability to understand human emotion, viewing Grace's ordinary human suffering as a distracting variable rather than the key to the lock. He was building a throne for a mind that Spencer had already decided to let die in the darkness of his mansion. Evidence suggests that his obsession with the transfer theory was a way to justify his own biological surrender. If memories could be transplanted, then Gideon could theoretically survive his own transformation by encoding his mind into a new host. He saw Elpis as the tool for his own immortality, a way to become the permanent sentinel of the Master's vision. He was a man who was trying to pick a biological lock with a surgical hammer, unaware that the door to the Ark was already bolted shut from the other side by a founder who had finally found the value of silence. Ultimately, the memory transfer theory was the engine of Gideon's undoing. It led him to create Subject 171, to murder Alyssa Ashcroft, and to eventually chase a girl into the ruins of Raccoon City for a word he didn't even know. He was the disciple who had memorized the letters but forgotten the spirit of the work. He spent his entire life trying to unlock a future that his God had already decided to cancel. A true believer who was destined to find that the key to the future was actually an eraser for the past. For nearly a decade, the life of Grace Ashcroft was not her own, but a series of data points monitored by Victor Gideon from the clinical isolation of his laboratory. Gideon was the first to identify the emergence of Raccoon City syndrome, recognizing the latent T virus infection in survivors, years before the medical community began to see the pattern. He understood that the biological debt of 1998 was a ticking clock, and he believed that Grace was the only person who held the key to surviving the final alarm. He viewed her as the golden sample, the singular biological legacy of Alyssa Ashcroft's survival. Gideon's surveillance was exhaustive and predatory, conducted through the resources of the connections to ensure he never lost sight of his asset. His agents lived in the shadows of Grace's mundane life, documenting her years at school, her medical checkups, and even collecting discarded biological material from salons to verify her genomic stability. To Gideon, this was not an act of stalking, but a necessary phase of a long-term clinical study. He grew to love her in a way that only a radicalized scientist could, viewing her development with the same possessive pride a researcher feels for a successful culture in a petri dish. He waited specifically for the 20th anniversary of the Raccoon City incident, believing that the viral clock within Grace's marrow would finally prime the password for extraction. He theorized that her DNA would undergo a specific epigenetic shift as the syndrome matured, revealing the blood memory that Spencer had supposedly hidden within her. Every photo his agents took and every report they filed was a piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve since the Ark sublevels were sealed. Grace was a biological hard drive that he was waiting to decrypt. The clinical horror of this surveillance is found in the total reduction of a human life to a tactical variable. Grace was allowed to go to college and join the FBI only because Gideon believed it would keep her stationary and observable. He wanted her to feel safe so that her biology remained stable, unaware that her ordinary human suffering was the very thing that made her unique. He watched her grow from a traumatized child into a professional adult, his interest never wavering from the protein structures and the antibody counts that he monitored from his monitors at Rhodes Hill. Evidence suggests that Gideon's obsession with Grace was the only thing that kept his fracturing mind focused as the Ne-gamma parasite continued its integration. He lived through her data, using her life as a proxy for the future he was trying to build. Many in the community interpret this period as the moment Gideon's humanity finally evaporated. leaving behind a creature that could only see the world through a microscope. He was the sentinel of a girl who didn't know she was being watched, a ghost who was waiting for the exact moment the golden sample was ready for the harvest. As the crisis of 2026 approached, Gideon's surveillance became more aggressive as he sensed the ripening of the Elpis Project. He knew that the syndrome was beginning to manifest in other survivors like Leon Kennedy, and he understood that the window for extraction was closing. The years of watching were coming to an end, and the scientist was finally ready to step out of the shadows and claim the legacy he believed was his by right of devotion. Grace Ashcroft was about to find out that her entire life had been a lead-in to a reunion with a monster. The events of 2018 mark the point where Victor Gideon's clinical obsession turned into visceral violence. Alyssa Ashcroft had begun to connect the disappearances at Roadsill to the broader shadow network of the connections, her investigative tenacity once again threatening the secrecy of the project. Recognizing that the reporter was on the verge of exposing his new church, Gideon took personal action to neutralize the threat. He lured Alyssa to the Wrenwood Hotel under the guise of a whistleblower meeting, intending to erase the only person who truly understood the history of the foundling. The murder of Alyssa Ashcroft was a moment of profound administrative and personal cruelty. Gideon didn't just kill her. Evidence suggests he attempted to scan her first, operating on a desperate theory that the mother might hold a secondary key to the Ark. When Grace intervened, Gideon's carefully maintained clinical detachment shattered. He murdered Alyssa by stabbing her in the neck in front of her 16-year-old daughter, an act of cleansing designed to remove the human influence he believed was contaminating his sample. It was the end of the reporter's story and the beginning of the analyst's nightmare. In the chaos of the struggle, the teenage Grace acted on a raw survival instinct that Gideon never anticipated. She threw a chemical accelerant onto the scientist, which was ignited by a broken oil lamp in the hotel hallway. Because of his ongoing Ne-gamma parasite integration, Gideon's skin had become highly flammable, and the resulting fire burned with a heat that bypassed his newly acquired regenerative abilities. This was the first time the golden sample had ever wounded the researcher, a moment of defiance that left Gideon physically and psychologically scarred for life. The hotel fire served as the funeral pyre for Grace's childhood and the birth of Gideon's personal vendetta. As the facility was consumed by flames, Gideon fled into the night, his face a melted ruin of scar tissue that his science could not fully repair. He left behind a traumatized girl and the body of the woman who had bankrupted Umbrella, his obsession now fueled by a deep, hateful resentment. He had succeeded in silencing the reporter, but he had inadvertently created a witness who would spend the next 8 years preparing to finish her mother's work. The decision to kill Alyssa in such a brutal and intimate manner reveals how far Gideon had traveled from the researcher who once talked to Vats in 1998. He was no longer a man of science. He was a man of the parasite. Many believe this points toward the Ne-gamma parasite's influence, which amplified his nihilism and his willingness to use violence to achieve his goals. The murder at the Wrenwood was the most honest expression of his character, a clinical removal of a liability that turned into a messy, visceral tragedy. The burns Gideon sustained became his mark of shame, a permanent reminder of the girl who had struck back. For 8 years, he wore the scars of the Wrenwood as a testament to his own hubris. He believed he was the master of the Ashcroft line, yet he carried the evidence of their resistance on his own flesh. The hotel was the site where the church of the virus met the reality of human grief, a collision that would lead both the scientist and the daughter back to the ruins of Raccoon City 8 years later. The burns Victor Gideon sustained at the Wrenwood Hotel were more than just physical injuries. They were a psychological violation of his perceived superiority. For a man who viewed himself as a high-level biological evolution, being scarred by a 16-year-old girl with a lamp was an intolerable humiliation. The fire had burned so hot that it damaged the Ne gamma parasite's ability to smoothly replicate his dermal tissue, leaving his face a permanent, melted landscape of scar tissue. Every time he looked in a mirror for the next 8 years, he was reminded of the golden sample who had dared to wound her creator. The scars became a central part of Gideon's identity, a physical manifestation of the resentment he held for the human race. He wore the mark of the person he needed most, creating a twisted psychological bond between the hunter and the prey. Whether his obsession with Grace after the hotel was purely clinical, or whether the wound introduced a personal malice, is a point of debate among those who study the ARC files. Many in the community believe that the burns transformed his mission from a data harvest into a personal conquest, where he sought to break Grace as much as he sought to use her. Gideon's physical assimilation with the Ne gamma parasite meant that his body could absorb incredible punishment, yet the burns remained as a stubborn anomaly. This suggested that his regeneration was tied to his psychological state, and he was unable to heal the wounds inflicted by the girl who represented his master's hope. The scars served as the friction he once spoke of, a constant source of pain that fueled his nihilism. He viewed the fire as a trial of his faith, a purgatory he had to endure until he could finally claim the Elpis antigen and restore his perfection. Grace's strike at the hotel was the first time Gideon was forced to acknowledge the agency of his subjects. Up until that night, he had viewed people as numbers and marrow. After the fire, he had to see them as enemies. The burns were the only human thing left on a man who was becoming a BOW, a bridge of pain that connected him back to the night he murdered Alyssa. It is theorized that he kept the scars visible specifically to remind his syndicate partners in the connections that the Ashcroft line was a dangerous and necessary priority. The psychological portrait of a man with a melted face and a parasite in his spine is one of absolute, unyielding darkness. Gideon used his injury to justify even greater atrocities at Rhodes Hill, viewing his own suffering as a license to inflict suffering on others. He believed that if he had to bear the mark of the fire, the rest of the world had to bear the mark of the syndrome. The burns were the signature of the Wrenwood Hotel, a contract signed in flame that ensured the analyst and the doctor would eventually have a final reckoning in the ruins. What Grace did to him was to make him visible. Before the fire, Gideon was a ghost in a lab coat. After the fire, he was a monster with a face the world could recognize. The burns were the undoing of his anonymity, a physical evidence of the biological war that was being fought in the shadows. As he prepared for the abduction in 2026, he viewed his scarred reflection as a reminder that the harvest was overdue. He was the keeper of the grave, and he was ready to pull the girl into the dark to see if she could burn him again. During the years between 2018 and 2025, as Grace Ashcroft lived in hiding at the FBI, Victor Gideon descended into a state of professional desperation. He realized that the surveillance was not enough to extract the password. and his own physical decay was accelerating. In a frantic attempt to bypass the need for the original foundling, he utilized the foundling DNA he had harvested from the floor of the Wrenwood Hotel to initiate a mass cloning project. He sought to replicate the Ashcroft genomic signature, believing he could manufacture a solution to the Spencer encryption without needing to risk a public abduction. Gideon produced dozens of Graces in the incubation tanks at Rhodes Hill, but the program was a series of catastrophic failures. He discovered that while he could replicate the flesh, he could not replicate the blood memory he was obsessed with. The clones did not inherit Grace's original experiences or the emotional synthesis required to unlock the ARC terminal. They were hollowed-out biological shells, their DNA too unstable to anchor the Elpis antigen. This failure was a profound blow to Gideon's ego, as it forced him to acknowledge that his master's hope was something his own science could not easily copy. Subject 171, known as Emily, was the closest the program ever came to a success, yet she remained a tragic monument to Gideon's desperation. The cloning process left her blind, emotionally stunted, and hypersensitive to light. The physical evidence of a genome that had been forced to mature too quickly. Gideon viewed Emily as trash, a living reminder of his own inability to replicate Spencer's hand-picked asset. He kept her in high-security isolation at Rhodes Hill, not out of care, but as a backup data point, a numbered failure in a program that had reached the triple digits. The scale of the clone program reveals the industrial appetite for the Ashcroft legacy. The 3-digit subject number for Emily suggests that Gideon had churned through hundreds of failed iterations in his pursuit of the password. Each tank and each disposal log was a testament to a man who could not accept that the answer required a human being rather than a biological copy. He was a researcher who had lost the ability to see the difference between a person and a prototype, treating the failed Graces with the same clinical indifference as medical waste. Many believe this points toward a total breakdown of Gideon's scientific logic. He was no longer researching the future. He was obsessively trying to reconstruct a past that he didn't understand. The clones were his way of talking to a dead god, an attempt to force Spencer's secrets into the light through the sheer volume of biological suffering. The desperation of the program highlighted Gideon's increasing instability as he realized that the 20th anniversary of Raccoon City was approaching, and he still lacked the key. Emily was the survivor of a slaughterhouse that Gideon called a laboratory. The clone program proved that the golden sample was truly unique. Gideon's failure to replicate Grace's memory synthesis confirmed that Spencer's encryption was rooted in the human spirit rather than just the human genome. This realization is what finally drove Gideon to initiate the abduction in 2026. He understood that the prototypes would never speak the password, and he had to claim the original before his own body collapsed. Emily was the numbered evidence of his hubris, a girl who would eventually be the one to help the original Grace dismantle his church. By the early 2020s, Victor Gideon found himself short on the resources and political cover needed to maintain his massive operations at Rhodes Hill. In a move of calculated desperation, he sold his soul to the shadow syndicate known as the Connections. He traded his decades of umbrella research and his proprietary medical data for their financial protection and the tactical service of Zeno. To Gideon, this was a necessary compromise to ensure the completion of his holy mission. Yet he held a profound contempt for his new partners, viewing them as commercial vultures who fundamentally misunderstood the sacred nature of the science. The dynamic between Gideon and Zeno was one of professional necessity and deep-rooted ideological conflict. Gideon frequently referred to the Wesker clone as a mere imitation, a reference that revealed his disdain for anyone who had not earned their biology through the decades of devotion he had practiced. He saw Zeno as a blunt instrument, a mimic of a greater man who lacked the vision to understand what the Ark truly represented. Gideon operated as a rogue variable within the connections, hiding the true nature of the Elpis Project from the people who were funding his pursuit of it. He lied to his syndicate partners with the same clinical ease he used on his patients, claiming that Elpis was a mind control pathogen that would allow them to enslave entire populations. He knew that the connections only valued what they could sell, and he crafted a narrative that appealed to their transactional greed. In his own mind, he was using them as useful idiots who provided the funding for his true spiritual work. He was a man who spent 30 years keeping Spencer's secret, and he was now keeping his own version of it to ensure that the Church of the Virus was not commercialized before he could claim it. This compromise highlights the isolation of the true believer. Gideon was a man who had no allies, only assets. He used the connection's political influence to freeze the DSO investigations and to monitor Grace's movements, but he never intended to share the final result with them. He believed that once the ARK was open and he had achieved transcendence, he would no longer need the Syndicate's protection. He was a man playing a global game of administrative hide-and-seek, she using a criminal organization as a shield for his own radicalized ambition. Many in the community interpret this partnership as the moment Gideon's church became a commercial front. While he told himself he was still serving Spencer's vision, he was in reality working for the very people who had lobbied for the destruction of Raccoon City. The irony was lost on him. His obsession with the work had led him to align himself with the architects of its original erasure. He was a scientist who had become so focused on the lock that he had forgotten who built the door. The connections were just the latest managers of a nightmare that Gideon believed he owned. The alliance with the connections was the final architecture of Gideon's cover-up. It provided the high-level clearance needed to operate the Rhodes blood farm and to prepare the road back to Raccoon City. Zeno was the sentinel of this compromise, a man whose presence reminded Gideon every day of what the corporation had become, a factory for imitations and a market for pathogens. Gideon tolerated the Syndicate because they were the only ones with the muscle to help him snatch the foundling, a tactical marriage that would eventually end in blood beneath the ruins. Bahiyom. The emergence of Raccoon City syndrome. In October 2026 was the signal Victor Gideon had been waiting for his entire adult life. He recognized the black marks on the survivors as the ripening of the biological debt, a sign that the viral clock within the Ashcroft line was finally ready for the final extraction. He utilized the global chaos caused by the syndrome to finally snatch Grace from the Wrenwood Hotel, she returning to the very site of his 1998 failure to claim his proprietary asset. The abduction was a masterpiece of tactical efficiency, conducted with the same clinical coldness he once used in the Tyrant vats. To ensure he could escape without immediate federal interference, Gideon released a localized T-virus outbreak at the hotel, willing to infect an entire public space just to retrieve one woman. This act of biological terrorism was a distraction designed to force the local authorities and the DSO into a containment mode. It revealed the total evaporation of Gideon's humanity. He viewed the lives of the hotel staff and guests as mere reagents to be consumed by the chaos. He was a man who had already sacrificed everything for the work, and he was not going to let a few civilian lives stand in the way of the harvest. The abduction occurred exactly 8 years after the murder of Alyssa Ashcroft, a detail that many believe was a deliberate psychological move by Gideon. He wanted Grace to return to the site of her greatest trauma, believing that the stress of the hotel would prime her blood memory for the marrow extraction. He was a scientist who viewed human emotion as a biological catalyst, a tool to be used in the service of the data. He returned to the Wrenwood not out of nostalgia, but out of a clinical desire to close the loop on the 19th anniversary of the city's fall. At the Rhodes Hill facility, Gideon performed a deep tissue marrow extraction on the captive Grace, an agonizing procedure that he conducted with a terrifyingly calm focus. Evidence suggests that Gideon actually wept during the extraction, not out of empathy for Grace's suffering, but out of a sense of religious ecstasy. He believed he was finally communicating with his dead god, Spencer, through the biological material of his foundling. He was a priest performing a ritual, his tears a testament to his absolute radicalization. He saw himself as the only one who could hear what the marrow was saying. Leon Kennedy arrived at the hotel just in time to witness the van fleeing the scene, but he was too late to stop the abduction. The veteran soldier found himself outmaneuvered by a man with a melted face and a parasite in his spine. You are a scientist who had successfully turned the city's ghosts into a tactical shield. This narrative collision set the stage for the final pursuit, as the agent and the doctor moved toward the ruins of the Midwest. Gideon had his key, and Leon had his mission, both driven by the biological clock that was ticking towards cellular failure. Ultimately, the abduction in 2026 was the fulfillment of a 30-year plan. Gideon had watched, waited, and scarred himself for this moment. He had the golden sample in his clinic, and he believed the password for Project Elpis was finally within his reach. He saw the abduction as an act of liberation, freeing Grace from her ordinary life so she could serve her higher purpose in the sub-levels of the Ark. He was the keeper of the grave, and he had finally retrieved the only thing that could make the grave speak. When Grace Ashcroft eventually woke up in the high-security wards of the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, she was not met with threats or violence from her captor. Instead, Dr. Victor Gideon greeted her with a terrifying, fatherly gentleness that was far more disturbing than any physical aggression. He introduced himself calmly, speaking to her as if she were a long-lost daughter rather than a research subject. He told her that he had been looking for her for a long time, and that with her help, he would finally be able to complete the work that Oswell E. Spencer had started in the 1960s. His confirmed words were built on a foundation of absolute delusion. He called Grace unique, stating that her life of ordinary human suffering was finally over. He framed the abduction not as a kidnapping, but as an act of freeing her from the mundane world of the Bureau. Gideon truly believed he was doing her a favor, viewing the extraction of her genomic data as the most important thing she could ever achieve. In his radicalized mind, he was the priest, and Grace was the sacrifice, a human variable being elevated to the status of a biological catalyst for the reset. This psychological portrait reveals a man who had spent so long telling himself the story of his own sacred mission that he had completely lost touch with reality. He didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a liberator who was completing the work that the master had left behind. He treated Grace with a clinical respect that was devoid of any actual human empathy, focusing entirely on the hope that she carried in her blood. He was a man who had successfully sanitized his atrocities through the language of evolution and evolution. Gideon's fatherly approach was a tool of psychological manipulation, intended to lower Grace's defenses and encourage the memory synthesis he needed for the password. He spoke of Alyssa Ashcroft not with regret for her murder, but with the cold detachment of a man who had removed a biological contamination. He wanted Grace to see herself through his eyes, as a golden sample, a piece of proprietary research that belonged to the Church of the Virus. He was a man who had hollowed out his own soul and was now trying to do the same to her. Many in the community interpret this scene as the moment the administrative evil of Umbrella is made personal. Gideon represents the corporation's belief that people are just numbers, and biology is just a lock to be picked. By treating Grace like a daughter while preparing to dismantle her, he showed the total disconnection between his technical brilliance and his moral void. He was a relic of the old guard, a man who still believed in the Master's vision, even as he carried the physical scars of its failure. Gideon's claim that he was freeing Grace was the ultimate lie of the pharmaceutical myth. He was a man who was trapped in his own obsession, and he wanted to pull the entire world into the grave with him. He saw himself as the successor to a dead god, unaware that the god he worshipped had already abandoned the ideology Gideon was trying to protect. He was the student who remembered every letter of the doctrine, but had forgotten the spirit of the humanity it was supposed to serve. He was waiting for a word that would prove him right, while the girl in the ward was preparing to prove him wrong. The final revelation at the Ark Terminal represents the total and absolute defeat of Victor Gideon's 30-year crusade. When Grace Ashcroft finally speaks the password, hope and Project Elpis is revealed to be a universal antiviral. The ideological foundation of Gideon's life is rendered a joke. He had spent 3 decades building a church to a weapon of transcendence, believing that Spencer's key to the future was a mind control supervirus that would allow him to perfect the human race in a matter of seconds, and he realized that he had spent his entire career building a vault for the very thing that would undo his life's work. Spencer's confirmed regret was the truth that Gideon could never have accepted. The founder had abandoned the ideology of the new man in his final years, choosing instead to create an eraser for the biological nightmare he had birthed. He had set up Elpis specifically to tear down everything the connections and his own legacy had built, placing the cure in the hands of the one person he knew would use it as a gift. Gideon realized that he was not the heir to a god, but the monster that the god wanted to cure. His master had surrendered to humanity, and Gideon had been left behind in the dark. What it meant for Gideon to know this truth was a total psychological fracture. He saw that his 30 years of devotion were based on a fundamental misreading of the notes, and that the man he worshipped had quietly become his ideological opposite. The hope he had hunted was not his salvation, but his termination. The irony was absolute. He had fought, scarred himself, and murdered to open a room that contained only the end of his church. He was a scientist whose entire worldview had been overwritten by a single human word. Evidence suggests that Gideon's mind snapped at this realization, his nihilism surging as the Ne gamma parasite sensed the collapse of his purpose. He could not conceive of a world where the virus was rendered inert, and he refused to accept a reality where he was ordinary. If the world was not going to evolve through Spencer's science, Gideon decided that it would burn because of it. He turned his failure into a final, suicidal act of defiance, choosing to become the very thing the antigen was designed to destroy. It is the truth revealed that Grace Ashcroft was not his biological asset. but the architect of his atonement. She was the one who truly understood Spencer's desire, while Gideon was merely the manager of the ruins. The student had been outmaneuvered by the foundling, and the Church of the Virus was being dismantled by the daughter of the reporter. Gideon's 30 years of surveillance and marrow extraction had led him back to the orphanage to find that his god had left him a requiem instead of a crown. The revelation at the terminal was the final bill for Gideon's radicalization. He had lived for the corporation, and now he was dying because of its end. He was a man who could not live in a world without Umbrella, a relic who was being erased by the very hope he had spent his life trying to weaponize. He was the true believer who had finally found that his god was a man, and the science was a cure. As the Archie began to shut down, Gideon prepared his final mutation, a monster born from the realization that the work was already over. The moment the terminal released Project Elpis, the fragile alliance between the Shadow Syndicate and the rogue scientist shattered into a display of biological irony. Zeno, the Wesker clone, who believed himself to be the pinnacle of genetic engineering, lunged for the first vial of the universal antiviral. He operated on the false assumption that Elpis was the mind control supervirus Gideon had promised, a weapon that would finally grant him a sovereign identity beyond being a mere imitation. Instead, the moment the antigen entered his system, it began a rapid and aggressive deconstruction of the viral foundation that allowed his superhuman speed and durability to exist. Grace and the dying Leon watched as the Wesker clone collapsed into a heap of baseline, fragile human flesh. The T-virus fragments and the experimental enhancements that provided Zeno with his bullet-dodging reflexes were systematically dismantled by the Elpis proteins. He was reduced to an ordinary man in a matter of seconds, his slicked back hair and expensive suit now hanging off a frame that was no longer supported by an artificial biology. Zeno's screams were the sounds of a man who had finally achieved the humanity he had spent his life trying to evolve past. A realization that left him psychologically broken before the physical end even arrived. Victor Gideon arrived in the terminal room immediately following this depowering, having emerged from the shadows of the Ark sub-levels. He looked down at the shivering, baseline human who had once been his syndicate liaison with a surge of pure, cold nihilism. Gideon realized in that moment that the connections were as blind as he had been. She's chasing a weapon while holding the very substance that would render their entire industry obsolete. He saw Zeno not as a fallen ally, but as a living example of the reset Spencer had planned for the world. The execution of Zeno was performed with a clinical indifference that signaled the end of Gideon's professional restraint. He utilized a high-caliber sidearm to end the life of the weakened clone, a redundant act of violence for a man who was already biologically erased. For Gideon, the killing Zeno was a way to sever his final tie to the institutional world of the Connections and Umbrella. He was finally standing alone in the Ark, with the one thing he had always wanted. Yet he was standing in a room that contained only the undoing of his 30-year crusade. This moment reveals the total isolation of the true believer who finds his God has changed his mind. Gideon felt a profound sense of betrayal, not by Zeno, but by Spencer. If the world was not going to evolve through the science of the Tyrant and the Wesker lineage, Gideon decided that the world no longer deserved the order he had tried to build for it. He stood amidst the humming servers and the clinical displays of the OARC, the body of his last ally at his feet, and realized that his master had already surrendered the war. The tragedy of arriving at the destination only to find an eraser instead of a crown drove Gideon into his final, suicidal state of mind. He saw the Elpis antigen as a personal insult, a biological mockery of the 3 decades he had spent scarred and in exile. Many in the community interpret Zeno's death as the point where Gideon's mind finally snapped, moving from the pursuit of a weapon to the pursuit of total destruction. He was the last man left in the church, and he was ready to burn the temple down with himself inside it. In a final act of suicidal defiance, Victor Gideon chose to embrace the very horror that the Elpis antigen was designed to destroy. He rejected the possibility of the cure, viewing the restoration of his humanity as a fate worse than death. He reached into his personal clinical storage and retrieved a vial of the Nemesis Prime strain, a raw and concentrated version of the Ne alpha parasite that had already been rotting his mind for years. He injected the substance directly into his heart, triggering a catastrophic hypermutation that would turn his body into the definitive expression of Umbrella's ugly legacy. The transformation was a visceral and agonizing collapse of the human form. Gideon's body underwent a rapid cellular surge, his flesh splitting and weaving into the dense grey muscle mass of a high-level BOW. He grew to a height of 9 feet, his spine elongating and his limbs distorting into the massive tentacle-like appendages that defined the Nemesis series. This was the moment the Doctor finally became the monster he had worshipped in the 1998 VATs. He was no longer a man of science. He was a mindless, screaming engine of destruction, a biological echo of a city that had been vaporized 28 years prior. His final form was a 1-to-1 biological reflection of the Nemesis final phase, featuring the iconic glowing pustule that served as the core of the parasite. This central mass of organic material was the only thing keeping the creature's disparate systems functioning, a weak point that represented the inherent instability of the T-virus research. Gideon had become the very thing Alyssa Ashcroft had spent her life trying to expose, a clinical atrocity that retained only the echoes of its human host's ego. He was the ugly legacy of Spencer's inhumanity, a creature built on the refusal to accept the hope of the future. The persistent regeneration that Gideon had exhibited throughout the entire game was confirmed as the result of the Ne gamma parasite already inside him. He had been slowly becoming this nightmare for years. The stitches on his neck and the scars on his face, merely the early symptoms of his total biological surrender. By injecting the Nemesis Prime strain, he was simply accelerating the inevitable end of his path as a true believer. He was the student who had successfully turned himself into the most honest expression of his master's work, a monster that could only exist in the dark sub-levels of an archive. Capcom's framing of this transformation highlights the duality of the Spencer era. While Grace Ashcroft is the hope left behind by the founder's late-life humanity, Victor Gideon is the sickness left behind by his earlier, more destructive hubris. They are the two siblings of the Ark, the cure and the pathogen meeting in the room where the story began. Gideon's hypermutation was a rejection of the hope password, a physical choice to remain a part of the pharmaceutical myth, even as the myth was being dismantled by the analyst. To the creature that stood in the Ark terminal room was a tragic monument to 30 years of misread notes and radicalized faith. Gideon had sought godhood and transcendence, and he had found only the heavy, pulsing reality of a parasite. He was the priest who had become the sacrifice, his vocal cords too mutated to speak the name of the master he still worshipped. He was the final boss of the 1998 story, a relic of the orphanage who was ready to pull the entire facility into the grave with him as the final strike of the mission began. Trying to open the final battle between Leon Kennedy and the mutated Victor Gideon took place amidst the collapsing infrastructure of the ARC facility. As the sub-levels were consumed by the fires of the self-destruct sequence, Leon utilized the Requiem pistol to deliver the final strikes against the parasite's core. The veteran agent moved with a lethal efficiency that was fueled by the antigen Grace had provided. His hands no longer numb as he targeted the glowing pustules on Gideon's distorted frame. It was the final reckoning for the survivor of Raccoon City and the keeper of its darkest secret. When the core and the head of the creature were finally destroyed, Victor's massively mutated body began a terminal cellular collapse. His flesh melted into a pool of grey necrotic sludge, a physical manifestation of the distorted ideals he had tried to inherit from a dead man. The regeneration that had sustained him for 8 years was finally over, as the Elpis antigen in the room's atmosphere began to neutralize the viral fragments of his remains. Leon stood over the dissolving monster, and his final words to the scientist being a definitive closure: "You will not be revived anymore." The location of his death was the ultimate irony of his story. Gideon died in the ARC facility beneath the orphanage, the very room he had spent nearly 30 years trying to open. He had dedicated his entire adult life to reaching this terminal, believing it contained the key to his immortality and his master's vision. Instead, he died in the dark, beneath the ruins of the place where his obsession began. He was a man who had reached the destination only to find that he was the only thing in the room that didn't belong there. Gideon died without ever knowing that his original goal of liberating the Elpis Project had, in fact, been achieved by the very person he viewed as a passive asset. Grace had spoken the password and released the antigen, she fulfilling Spencer's final desire, while Gideon was still blinded by his misinterpretation of the weapon. He was the disciple who had been outmaneuvered by the foundling, a researcher who had died in the moment of his project's completion without ever understanding what it was. His death was a requiem for a man who had built his life on a foundation of administrative evil. The collapse of the ARC facility served as the burial for Gideon and the remnants of the Umbrella era. As the Hound Wolf squad breached the ceiling to extract the survivors, the melted remains of the scientist were buried under tons of radioactive ash and reinforced concrete. He disappeared along with the journals and the vats he had worshipped, leaving behind no legacy other than the trauma he had inflicted on the Ashcroft line. He was the phantom of the 1998 incident, finally put to rest in the grave he had spent his life guarding. Leon Kennedy's final strike was not just an act of survival, but an act of historical correction. By killing Gideon, he ensured that the Nemesis strain and the distorted vision of the connections could not claim the future. The doctor who had tried to archive the human spirit was himself deleted from the record, his name destined to be forgotten, while the report Grace published told the world the truth. Gideon was the sickness of the past that was finally purged by the hope of the present, a tragic relic whose time had finally run out in the ruins of the Midwest. Victor Gideon was never the successor to the Umbrella Empire. He was merely its most devoted relic. He represented the administrative evil that defined the corporation's peak years, the cold, clinical belief that people are just numbers, and that human biology is a lock to be picked for proprietary gain. While Grace Ashcroft is the hope left behind by Spencer's late-life humanity, Gideon was the shadow left behind by the founder's original hubris. He was the ghost that continued to walk the hallways of the 98 disaster, long after the fire had gone out. A man who mistook his own radicalization for a sacred calling. The tragedy of Victor Gideon is that he was a disciple who followed a vision that the visionary himself had already quietly rejected. He spent 30 years sacrificing his ethics, his reputation, and his own flesh to a church whose high priest had already confessed his sins and created an eraser for the doctrine. Gideon was not wrong that Spencer was a genius. He was only wrong about what that genius had ultimately decided to build. He was the man who spent his life protecting a weapon, only to find that it was a cure, a misreading of history that turned his entire biography into a dark and pointless joke. What separates a disciple from an heir is the ability to grow beyond the master, a trait that Gideon fundamentally lacked. He inherited the methodology of the Tyrant Project, but missed the evolution of Spencer's regret. He was a scientist who could only see the world through the lens of control and mutation, leaving him blind to the possibility of atonement. He was a man who had successfully automated his own obsolescence, becoming a BOW in a world that was already preparing for a post-viral future. He was the shadow that didn't know the light had already been turned on. His story is sad rather than simply evil, because it shows the human cost of absolute, unquestioning faith in a destructive system. Gideon was a brilliant man who hollowed himself out to be a better tool for a corporation, and in doing so, he lost the ability to recognize the value of his own life. He died in the moment of his project's completion, yet he died in total ignorance of its success. He was the keeper of a grave who didn't realize he was already inside it, a true believer who had been abandoned by his God decades before the final reckonings began. Ultimately, Gideon served as the terminal obstacle for the survivors of the pharmaceutical era. By defeating him, Leon and Grace were not just killing a monster, they were closing the book on the Spencer methodology. Gideon's death ensured that the ugly legacy of Umbrella remained buried under the ruins of the orphanage, allowing the world to move forward with the antigen he had tried to steal. He was the sickness Spencer left in the past, a relic whose final scream was the sound of a 30-year lie being silenced by the truth. The final irony of Victor Gideon is that the Elpis Project was indeed his greatest work, yet its success required his total defeat. He had successfully refined the antigen and maintained the facility, providing the infrastructure for the world's healing, while believing he was building its destruction. He was a man who had participated in his own undoing with the same clinical focus he used for his research. He died as Spencer's shadow, a man whose life was a requiem for a corporation that never loved him, leaving Grace and Emily to be the only real heirs of the Master's hope.